The Discernment Field, Episode 3, The Theatre of Manipulation, Dark Psychology Without Sensationalism. Hello, and welcome to the Discernment Field, a podcast on mind, behavior, perception, and the search for clarity in an emotionally reactive world. In the previous episode, we explored emotional intelligence, not as emotional control, but as emotional relationship, the ability to feel without immediately obeying feelings, to speak without weaponizing emotion, to listen without abandoning the self, and to remain conscious enough inside emotion that feeling does not become the only interpreter of reality. Now we move into a more uncomfortable territory, because if emotion shapes interpretation from within, manipulation often works by shaping emotion from the outside. It does not always begin with an obvious lie, a direct threat, or a dramatic act of control. Sometimes it begins with the atmosphere, a tone, a pause, a silence, a shift in warmth, a repeated implication, a carefully framed question, a moral accusation, a promise of belonging, a threat of rejection, a choice that is presented as free, while every emotional consequence has already been arranged around one acceptable answer. Manipulation is not always forced. Often, it is the arrangement of emotional conditions that makes one interpretation feel safer than another. This is why dark psychology should not be approached as theatre in the sensational sense. Shadowy masterminds, cartoon villains, secret tactics, and exaggerated paranoia. That kind of treatment can become its own distortion. It can make people see manipulation everywhere, confuse ordinary imperfection with abuse, or turn discernment into suspicion. But if we strip away the sensationalism, something more useful appears. Manipulation is often the subtle steering of perception, emotion, choice, and behavior, while the person being influenced still feels as if the conclusion is entirely their own. When emotion becomes the doorway, that is what makes it powerful. A person may not say, "You must obey me." They may say, "I'm only trying to help you." They may not say, "You are not allowed to question me." They may say, "It's interesting that accountability makes you defensive." They may not say, "I want you to feel guilty, so you do what I want." They may say, "I just thought you cared more than this." They may not say, "I am going to isolate you." They may say, "Other people have noticed this about you too." The control is not always in the sentence alone. It is in the field around the sentence. It is what the sentence makes emotionally expensive to question. It is in the guilt, shame, fear, confusion, urgency, flattery, or dependency created around the interaction. It is in the way a person is pushed into defending themselves before they have even clarified what happened. This episode is not an invitation to become paranoid. It is not about accusing everyone of manipulation. It is not about treating every difficult conversation as psychological warfare. People are imperfect. People become defensive. People communicate badly. People project. People avoid accountability. People say careless things when they are hurt. Not every painful interaction is manipulation. Not every disagreement is gaslighting. Not every emotional reaction is controllable. But some patterns do steer perception. Some patterns do destabilize reality testing. Some patterns do use guilt, fear, desire, shame, ambiguity, or belonging as leverage. Some patterns do make it harder for a person to trust what they saw, what they felt, what they remember, or what they know. So the aim of this episode is proportionate discernment, to recognize manipulation without becoming possessed by suspicion, to understand dark psychology without glamorizing it, to see the stage without assuming every person is an actor with malicious intent. Because sometimes manipulation is deliberate, and sometimes it is unconscious. Sometimes people control others because they are calculated. Sometimes they control others because they themselves are controlled by fear, insecurity, status needs, shame, envy, dependency, or unresolved trauma. The effect still matters, but discernment asks us to see clearly rather than reactively. The central question of this episode is simple. What happens when another person, group, system, or environment begins shaping the emotional state through which we interpret reality? Because once emotion is shaped, perception becomes easier to steer. What is manipulation, influence, persuasion, and control? To understand manipulation clearly, we first have to separate it from ordinary influence. Influence is inevitable. We influence each other constantly. A warm voice can settle a room. A thoughtful question can widen perception. A piece of music can change one's emotional state. A teacher can shape how a student sees a subject. A friend can help us reconsider a situation. A parent influences a child. A culture influences identity. A conversation influences mood. Influence is not automatically unethical. It is part of being relational creatures. Persuasion can also be ethical. If I present an argument honestly, show my reasoning, allow you space to disagree, and respect your capacity to choose, I am attempting persuasion. Persuasion becomes healthy when it expands awareness rather than narrowing it. It offers evidence. It allows questions. It does not hide its motive. It does not punish disagreement. It does not require you to abandon your perception to remain connected. Negotiation can also be mutual. Two people may want different things. They communicate, compromise, set boundaries, and seek an outcome both can live with. That is not manipulation because someone wants an outcome. Wanting something is not manipulation. Expressing a need is not manipulation. Making a request is not manipulation. Feeling disappointed when the answer is no is not manipulation. Human beings are allowed to influence each other through honesty, emotion, care, and desire. Manipulation begins when the field becomes distorted. Manipulation shapes another person's perception, emotion, or behavior while concealing the real motive, distorting the frame, withholding relevant information, exploiting vulnerability, or making one choice emotionally safer than another in a way the other person cannot clearly see. It narrows awareness while making the narrowed path feel like freedom. That last part matters. Healthy influence says, here is what I think, here is why. What do you think? Manipulation says, here is the frame, and if you question it, there will be a cost. Healthy persuasion gives information. Manipulation controls the emotional meaning of information. Healthy negotiation respects the other person's reality. Manipulation tries to make the other person doubt, abandon, or reorganize their reality around the manipulator's needs. For example, there is a difference between a friend saying, when you cancelled at the last minute, I felt hurt, and a friend saying, if you were a decent person, you would never have done that to me. The first statement expresses impact. The second uses shame to pressure identity. There is a difference between a partner saying, I need reassurance tonight, and a partner saying, if you loved me, you would know exactly what I need without me asking. The first invites connection. The second creates guilt and impossible expectations. There is a difference between a leader saying, this situation is serious, and here is the evidence for why we need to act, and a leader saying, only selfish or ignorant people would question this. The first persuades. The second frames doubt as moral failure. Manipulation often works because it does not feel like control at first. It feels like care, urgency, intimacy, authority, moral clarity, specialness, responsibility, or rescue. That is why it can be so difficult to identify while it is happening. The person being manipulated may not feel dominated. They may feel chosen, needed, guilty, afraid, enlightened, responsible, or uniquely trusted. The emotional state becomes the doorway. This is where discernment has to become very precise. The question is not simply, do I feel bad? Feeling bad does not automatically mean manipulation is present. Sometimes truth feels uncomfortable. Sometimes accountability hurts. Sometimes boundaries disappoint us. Sometimes reality interrupts the story we preferred. The better question is, does this interaction expand or narrow my ability to see clearly? Healthy influence may challenge us, but it usually leaves our perception more intact. Manipulation leaves us more confused, more dependent, more ashamed, more urgent, more afraid to question, more desperate for approval, or more willing to abandon our own evidence to preserve connection. A useful distinction is this. Healthy influence respects the other person's agency. Manipulation recruits the other person's nervous system against their agency. It uses emotional charge to make certain choices feel unbearable. If you say no, you are cruel. If you question, you are disloyal. If you ask for evidence, you are defensive. If you need time, you are avoidant. If you disagree, you are unsafe. If you remember differently, you are unstable. If you set a boundary, you are abandoning them. The person is no longer responding freely to the situation. They are responding to the emotional consequences attached to each option. This can happen in intimate relationships, families, workplaces, communities, political groups, spiritual groups, online spaces, advertising and media systems. Anywhere human emotion can be shaped, perception can be steered. But again, proportion matters. We should not use the word manipulation to avoid every difficult feeling. If someone tells us a truth we do not want to hear, that is not manipulation. If someone sets a boundary and we feel rejected, that is not automatically manipulation. If someone challenges our behavior and we feel shame, that is not automatically manipulation. The presence of discomfort does not prove control. Manipulation is not defined by discomfort alone. It is defined by distortion, concealment, leverage, repeated pressure, and the narrowing of another person's capacity to perceive, choose, or respond freely. So, as we move through this episode, we are not looking for villains under every interaction. We are learning to read patterns. What emotion is being activated? What interpretation is being made easier? What interpretation is being made costly? What information is missing? What role am I being assigned? What happens if I do not accept the frame? What behavior is being rewarded? What truth is becoming difficult to speak? These are the questions that bring manipulation out of the shadows without turning discernment into paranoia. Because the goal is not to become suspicious of everyone. The goal is to become less available to emotional steering that disconnects us from our own perception. The emotional entry points, fear, guilt, shame, desire, and belonging. If manipulation often begins by shaping the emotional state through which reality is interpreted, then we have to understand the emotional entry points. These are the doors through which influence becomes control. Not because emotion is weak, irrational, or inferior to thought, but because emotion changes the conditions under which thought takes place. When fear, guilt, shame, desire, belonging, confusion, or urgency become strong enough, interpretation narrows. The mind begins looking for relief, safety, approval, certainty, or connection rather than truth. This is why manipulation does not always need to defeat someone's intelligence. It only needs to activate the state in which their intelligence begins working for the emotional demand. Once fear is activated, intelligence may search for danger. Once guilt is activated, intelligence may search for reasons to comply. Once shame is activated, intelligence may search for ways to repair the image of the self. Once desire is activated, intelligence may minimize warning signs. Once belonging is activated, intelligence may defend the group. The mind keeps functioning, but the direction of its work has been influenced. Fear is one of the most obvious entry points. Fear says, you are not safe unless you do this. It can be used in intimate relationships, political messaging, advertising, workplaces, families, health narratives, financial decisions, and social groups. A person, group, or system does not have to prove danger fully if it can create enough emotional atmosphere around danger. The body begins reacting before the evidence has been calmly examined. Fear compresses the field. It turns complexity into urgency. It makes hesitation feel irresponsible and compliance feel protective. Sometimes fear is legitimate. Sometimes danger is real. Sometimes urgent action is necessary. Discernment is not about dismissing fear. It is about examining how fear is being used. Is fear being paired with evidence, proportion, and a clear path of action? Or is fear being amplified while context is withheld? Are people being helped to understand risk, or are they being kept activated? Are they being invited into grounded response, or pushed into obedience, panic, hostility, or dependency? A healthy warning gives people orientation. Manipulative fear keeps people dysregulated. Guilt is another powerful entry point because it attaches behavior to moral identity. Guilt says, if you cared, you would do this. If you were loyal, you would agree. If you loved me, you would know what I need. If you were a good person, you would sacrifice your boundary. Guilt is effective because most people do not want to feel selfish, cruel, ungrateful, uncaring, or morally deficient. So the person begins acting not from clarity, but from the desire to escape the emotional burden of being made to feel bad. There is, of course, healthy guilt. Healthy guilt appears when we recognize genuine harm or responsibility. It invites repair, apology, correction, and accountability. But manipulative guilt inflates responsibility beyond what actually belongs to us. It makes us responsible for someone else's emotional stability, their choices, their disappointment, their regulation, their unmet needs, or their refusal to communicate directly. It turns care into compliance. It makes saying no feel like betrayal. A discerning question around guilt is, what am I actually responsible for here? Am I responsible for repairing harm I caused, or am I being made responsible for someone's inability to tolerate disappointment? Am I being asked to show care, or am I being pressured to abandon myself so someone else does not have to feel uncomfortable? Guilt becomes manipulative when it disconnects responsibility from reality and attaches it to emotional pressure. Shame goes even deeper because guilt says, I did something wrong, while shame says, I am wrong. Shame targets identity. It not only pressures behavior, it pressures the self. You are selfish. You are unstable. You are too sensitive. You are difficult. You are not evolved enough. You are the problem. Shame is powerful because it creates a desire to disappear, apologize, submit, prove worth, or regain belonging. It narrows perception around social survival. Manipulative shame often appears as moral superiority. Someone positions themselves as more aware, more healed, more rational, more compassionate, more loyal, more enlightened, or more virtuous. Then your disagreement becomes evidence of your deficiency. If you question the frame, you are defensive. If you resist the demand, you are selfish. If you ask for evidence, you are avoiding accountability. If you name their behavior, you are projecting. The issue is no longer the issue. Your character is now on trial. This is why shame can silence discernment. The person stops asking, is this true? And starts asking, how do I stop feeling exposed? They may over-explain, apologize prematurely, accept blame, withdraw, comply, or try to prove they are good. In that state, reality testing becomes harder because the nervous system is trying to protect the self from social annihilation. A discerning response to shame begins by slowing down and separating identity from behavior. What specifically happened? What behavior is being named? Is there evidence? Is the criticism proportionate? Is this person addressing the issue or using shame to control the frame? Desire is a subtler entry point and in some ways one of the most seductive. Desire says, this will make you special. This will make you loved. This will make you chosen. This will make you admired. This will finally give you the life, body, status, relationship, knowledge, identity, or belonging you have been longing for. Manipulation through desire does not always feel threatening. It can feel exciting, intimate, meaningful, even sacred. It offers an emotional future that the person begins to move towards. Advertising uses desire constantly, but so do relationships, groups, influencers, ideologies, and status systems. The product is not always an object. Sometimes the product is identity. Become the kind of person who knows this, joins this, believes this, looks like this, lives like this, loves like this, sees through what others cannot. Once desire becomes attached to identity, discernment becomes vulnerable. The person may ignore warning signs because the emotional reward is too attractive. In relationships, desire can make inconsistency feel like depth. Someone gives warmth, then withdraws. They create longing, then offer fragments of closeness. The person begins chasing the emotional high of being chosen again. The relief after distance starts to feel like love. The anxiety before contact starts to feel like chemistry. Desire does not simply want the person. It wants the resolution of the wound the person has activated. This is why desire requires reality testing. What am I drawn to? What am I ignoring? Is this connection expanding my clarity or narrowing it? Do I feel more myself here or more dependent on being chosen? Belonging is another powerful doorway because human beings are social creatures. We are not designed to be indifferent to exclusion. Belonging says, people like us think this way. People like us do not ask those questions. People like us know who the enemy is. People like us understand the truth. This kind of influence is extremely strong because it attaches interpretation to identity and community. To question the belief may feel like risking the tribe. Belonging can be healthy. Communities can support growth, courage, repair, learning, and moral action. But belonging becomes manipulative when acceptance depends on surrendering discernment. If you have to stop asking questions to remain included, the group is not only offering belonging, it is managing perception. If doubt is treated as betrayal, if nuance is punished, if outsiders are dehumanized, if loyalty is measured by agreement, then belonging has become an instrument of control. This can happen in political spaces, spiritual communities, activist groups, workplaces, families, online subcultures, fandoms, and even healing spaces. The content may differ, but the structure is similar. Agreement brings warmth, questioning brings distance, compliance brings approval, independence brings suspicion. Over time, the nervous system learns what is safe to think. The person may still believe they are choosing freely, but the emotional cost of free thought has been raised. Confusion is another entry point, and it is often underestimated. Confusion says you cannot trust your own perception. It creates dependency by making reality feel unstable. This may happen through contradiction, shifting standards, mixed signals, denial, vague accusations, changing explanations, or emotional unpredictability. The person becomes so focused on trying to understand the manipulator's reality that they lose contact with their own. Confusion is powerful because the mind seeks resolution. If someone creates confusion and then offers themselves as the source of clarity, dependency can form. In relationships, this may look like someone creating emotional chaos and then providing comfort. In workplaces, it may look like unclear expectations followed by criticism. In ideological spaces, it may look like destabilizing someone's previous worldview and then offering the group as the only safe interpretation. Confusion weakens confidence. It makes a person more likely to seek external confirmation. Urgency completes the pattern. Urgency says, you must decide now, you must respond now, you must act now. If you wait, you will lose. Urgency is one of the clearest signs that discernment may be under pressure. Sometimes urgency is real, but manipulators often create artificial urgency because time allows regulation to return. Time allows questions. Time allows people to compare evidence, speak to others, notice patterns, and recover agency. The more a person is rushed, the less likely they are to examine the frame. This is why the pause is so important. Manipulation dislikes the pause. Fear wants immediate safety. Guilt wants immediate repair. Shame wants immediate self-restoration. Desire wants immediate fulfillment. Belonging wants immediate alignment. Confusion wants immediate explanation. Urgency wants immediate action. But discernment says, slow the field. Ask what emotion is being activated. Ask what interpretation that emotion makes easier. Ask what choice is being made emotionally costly. Ask what evidence is present and what evidence is missing. Ask whether the request respects your agency or recruits your nervous system against it. Because if we do not know our emotional entry points, someone else may learn them before we do. They may learn that fear makes us compliant, guilt makes us available, shame makes us apologetic, desire makes us blind, belonging makes us loyal, confusion makes us dependent, and urgency makes us careless. The goal is not to become closed or suspicious. It is to become readable to ourselves, to know which doors are most easily opened, to know when a feeling is being honored and when it is being used, to know when influence expands awareness and when it narrows the field. Manipulation begins where emotion stops being understood and starts being steered. Discernment begins when we notice the steering. Framing, the first stage of control, controlling the meaning before the conversation begins. Framing is one of the most important mechanisms in manipulation because it shapes the meaning of a situation before the situation has been properly examined. It does not always change the facts directly. Sometimes it changes the emotional atmosphere around the facts. It tells you how to interpret what is happening, what kind of person you are if you accept or resist the interpretation, and what emotional cost will come with stepping outside the frame. This is why framing can be so powerful. It does not need to force a conclusion if it can make one conclusion feel safer, kinder, wiser, more loyal, more moral, more intelligent, or less costly than the alternatives. A frame is the invisible container around meaning. It decides what counts as relevant, what counts as suspicious, what counts as evidence, what counts as betrayal, what counts as maturity, what counts as harm, what counts as care, and what kind of response will be socially or emotionally rewarded. Two people can describe the same event differently and create entirely different emotional realities. You questioned me in front of everyone creates one frame. You humiliated me publicly creates another. I need some time to think creates one frame. You are abandoning the conversation creates another. I disagree with that interpretation creates one frame. You are refusing accountability creates another. The event may be similar, but the frame changes the field. This is why whoever controls the frame often controls the emotional meaning of the event. Framing is not always manipulative. We all frame things. Whenever we explain a situation, we are selecting emphasis. We choose where to begin the story, what to include, what to leave out, what tone to use, and what meaning to suggest. Healthy framing is transparent enough to be questioned. It allows the other person to say, I see it differently. It does not punish alternative interpretations. Manipulative framing is different. It tries to make one interpretation feel morally mandatory and other interpretations feel dangerous, selfish, foolish, immature, disloyal, or cruel. A manipulative frame often arrives before the actual conversation. It sets the emotional rules. I'm only saying this because I care about you. That sentence may be true, but it can also create a frame where any resistance looks like rejecting care. Everyone else agrees with me. That frame turns the conversation from one person's concern into a social referendum. You're being difficult. That frame makes the issue not the issue itself, but your supposed character. This is for your own good. That frame turns control into care. Only selfish people would question this. That frame makes doubt into moral failure. You're either with us or against us. That frame eliminates nuance before the mind has time to think. These phrases are powerful because they do not merely communicate content. They position the listener. They assign roles. One person becomes the caring one, the reasonable one, the enlightened one, the harmed one, the responsible one, the mature one. The other becomes the difficult one, the selfish one, the defensive one, the unstable one, the unsafe one, the immature one. Once those roles are established, the conversation no longer begins at ground level. It begins on a tilted stage. This is why manipulation can feel so confusing. The person may enter a conversation wanting to clarify a specific issue, but the frame quickly shifts. They raise a concern, and suddenly they are defending their tone. They ask a question, and suddenly they are being accused of mistrust. They set a boundary, and suddenly they are being told they are cruel. They challenge a decision, and suddenly they are being told they are not a team player. They name a pattern, and suddenly the conversation becomes about their emotional instability. The original issue disappears into the frame created around their response. A common manipulative frame is the false binary. A false binary presents only two options when more possibilities exist. You either trust me, or you don't. You either care about this cause, or you are part of the problem. You either support me completely, or you are against me. You either forgive me now, or you are holding on to negativity. You either believe me without question, or you are invalidating me. This kind of frame is powerful because it compresses complexity into identity choices. The person is not being asked to examine reality. They are being asked to prove who they are. False binaries are emotionally efficient. They create urgency. They simplify. They make the middle ground feel cowardly or morally suspect. But real life often contains more than two options. You can trust someone generally and still ask for clarity. You can care about a cause and still question a method. You can support someone and still challenge their behavior. You can forgive someone and still need time. You can validate emotion without accepting every interpretation attached to it. Discernment reopens the space that the false binary tries to close. Another framing tactic is loaded language. Loaded language uses words with strong emotional or moral charge to pre-shape interpretation. If someone calls a concern drama, the person raising it is already positioned as excessive. If someone calls a question an attack, the questioner is already positioned as aggressive. If someone calls disagreement violence, the disagreement is emotionally escalated before being examined. If someone calls boundaries abandonment, self-protection is framed as cruelty. If someone calls criticism hate, accountability becomes persecution. Again, the issue may contain real harm or real conflict, but loaded language can make proportion harder to maintain. Loaded language can also work in softer forms. I'm disappointed in you may be appropriate in some contexts, but it can also be used to activate shame and compliance. I thought you were different can sound intimate, but it may frame independence as betrayal. After everything I've done for you can frame love as debt. I'm just trying to keep this space safe can frame dissent as danger. I'm concerned about your energy can frame disagreement as pathology. These phrases are not always manipulative, but they deserve attention because they carry more than content. They carry emotional positioning. Moral positioning is another major form of framing. This happens when someone places themselves in the morally superior role before the conversation begins. They are the compassionate one, the conscious one, the rational one, the victimized one, the spiritually evolved one, the socially aware one, the protector of safety, the defender of truth. Once that role is established, disagreement with them can become disagreement with compassion, consciousness, reason, healing, justice, or truth itself. This makes the frame difficult to challenge because challenging the person begins to feel like challenging the virtue they are claiming to represent. This can happen in relationships, workplaces, activism, spiritual communities, family systems, politics, and online discourse. A person says, "I'm just trying to be honest," while using honesty as a weapon. Another says, "I'm protecting my peace while avoiding accountability." Another says, "I'm holding you accountable while using shame to dominate the conversation." Another says, "I'm speaking my truth while refusing to consider the impact." Another says, "I'm concerned about your well-being while controlling behavior through false care." The language may sound virtuous, but discernment asks whether it is opening reality or closing it. Preemptive defense is another common frame. This is when someone anticipates criticism and disarms it before it can be expressed. You're probably going to overreact to this. I know you'll twist what I'm saying. You never take feedback well. I can already tell you're getting defensive. Don't make this about you. These statements put the other person in a trap. If they respond with hurt, they prove they are overreacting. If they clarify, they prove they are defensive. If they challenge the claim, they prove they are twisting the conversation. The frame has already defined its response before it has been made. This is especially destabilizing because it turns the person's attempt to defend their reality into evidence against them. They may begin over-explaining, apologizing, or trying to speak perfectly so they cannot be framed negatively. But the more they try to escape the frame, the more they may appear caught inside it. That is one reason manipulative framing is so effective. It turns normal self-advocacy into suspicious behavior. Identity traps are closely related. An identity trap attaches the desired behavior to the person's sense of self. You're a good person, so I know you'll help. You're not like those people who question everything. You're too mature to let this bother you. You're such an empath, you understand why I need this. You believe in kindness, don't you? The frame does not simply ask for an action. It suggests that refusal would contradict the identity the person wants to maintain. If they say no, they risk feeling selfish, immature, unkind, disloyal, or hypocritical. This is why emotionally intelligent people, compassionate people, conscientious people, and reflective people can sometimes be highly vulnerable to identity traps. Their values are real, but the manipulative frame exploits those values. It turns kindness into compliance. It turns empathy into emotional labor. It turns maturity into silence. It turns loyalty into self-betrayal. It turns open-mindedness into tolerance of disrespect. A discerning person has to remember that values are not meant to be levers others pull to control behavior. Values need boundaries to remain healthy. Authority framing is another major mechanism. This occurs when someone uses status, expertise, group consensus, spiritual authority, professional language, institutional position, or social credibility to make their interpretation feel superior before it is tested. As someone who understands this better than you, the experts agree. Everyone in leadership sees it this way. People with your trauma background often react like this. Spiritually, this is your shadow. From a therapeutic perspective, you are avoiding accountability. Sometimes expertise is legitimate and important, but authority becomes manipulative when it discourages questions, hides weak evidence, or uses status to override lived perception. A healthy authority can explain, clarify, and be questioned. A manipulative authority requires compliance with the frame. It makes one feel ignorant, dangerous, immature, or ungrateful. This is especially powerful when the listener already feels uncertain. If someone is confused, ashamed, grieving, inexperienced, or desperate for direction, authority framing can become a shortcut to surrendering perception. The person may think, they must know better than me. Sometimes they might, but discernment asks, does this authority help me see more clearly, or does it make me dependent on their interpretation? Then there is the victim-persecutor-rescuer frame. This frame assigns emotional roles in a drama. Someone becomes the victim who cannot be questioned. Someone becomes the persecutor who must be condemned. Someone becomes the rescuer who offers protection, clarity, or moral order. This structure can appear in families, communities, online controversies, political movements, and intimate relationships. It is powerful because it simplifies moral complexity. The victim is pure, the persecutor is bad, the rescuer is noble. Once these roles are emotionally established, evidence that complicates them may be rejected. This does not mean victims are not real. Real harm exists. Real perpetrators exist. Real protection is sometimes necessary. The problem is when the frame is used to prevent examination. A person can be harmed and still misinterpret aspects of a situation. A rescuer can help and still enjoy control. A person accused of harm can be accountable and still not be the full monster the frame requires. Discernment does not erase moral judgment. It refuses to let emotional roles replace reality testing. Framing also appears in subtle relational dynamics. Imagine someone says, I'm not angry, I just find it interesting how you always need things your way. The frame makes the other person selfish, while preserving the speaker's appearance of calm observation. Or someone says, I guess I just care more than you do. The frame turns differences in capacity, expression, or timing into a moral hierarchy. Or someone says, you can leave if you want, I'm used to people abandoning me. The frame makes the other person responsible for the speaker's wound before any specific request has been discussed. These frames create emotional pressure without openly naming a demand. The key discernment question is always, what frame am I being invited into? Am I being asked to clarify reality or to defend my character? Am I being invited into mutual understanding or into a role someone has already written for me? Am I being asked for accountability or being pressured into shame? Am I being given evidence or being handed an emotional script? Am I free to disagree without punishment? Am I free to ask questions? Am I free to say no? Am I free to remember differently? Am I free to take time? Am I free to leave the frame? That last question is powerful. What happens if I do not accept this frame? If the frame is healthy, it can tolerate examination. If someone says, I felt hurt, and you ask, can we slow down and understand what happened? There is room. If someone says, I have a concern, and you ask for specifics, there is room. If someone says, this matters to me, and you ask what they need, there is room. Healthy communication can handle clarification. Manipulative framing often cannot. It treats clarification as resistance, questions as betrayal, and pause as avoidance. So the practice is to slow the frame before entering it. Do not immediately argue within the terms you have been given. Step back and name the structure. I want to understand the specific issue, but I do not accept the frame that asking questions means I do not care. I can hear that you are hurt, but I do not accept that my boundary means abandonment. I am willing to discuss my behavior, but not through a frame where I am already defined as selfish. Can we separate what happened from the meaning being placed on it? These responses are powerful because they do not merely defend against content. They challenge the architecture of the conversation. This is not easy. Manipulative frames create emotional pressure precisely so that stepping outside them feels dangerous. You may feel guilty, selfish, cold, defensive, disloyal, or cruel. That feeling is part of what the frame produces. Discernment does not mean ignoring the feeling. It means asking whether the feeling is being used to move you into a role. Framing is the first stage of control because it sets the stage before the performance begins. It decides who gets sympathy, who gets suspicion, what counts as evidence, what counts as avoidance, what counts as care, and what counts as harm. Once the stage is built, people often begin playing their assigned parts without noticing the script. The discerning person learns to pause at the edge of the stage. They ask, what is the frame? Who benefits from this frame? What emotion does it create? What interpretation becomes easier inside it? What truth becomes harder to speak? What happens if I refuse the role being offered to me? Because sometimes freedom begins not by winning the argument, but by refusing the frame that made the argument impossible to have honestly. Gaslighting and reality distortion. When perception becomes the battleground, if framing is the first stage of control, then gaslighting is one of the most destabilizing forms of reality distortion. It not only tries to influence what a person thinks, it tries to weaken the person's confidence in their ability to know what happened, what they felt, what they remember, what they perceived, and whether their own interpretation can be trusted at all. This is why gaslighting has to be treated carefully. The word is used often now, sometimes accurately, sometimes too loosely. But when the pattern is real, its impact can be profound, because it turns perception itself into the battleground. Gaslighting is not simply disagreement. It is not simply someone having a different memory. It is not automatically gaslighting when someone says, that was not my intention, or I experienced that differently, or I do not agree with your interpretation. Human beings remember things differently. We misunderstand each other. We defend ourselves badly. We forget details. We minimize impact because we are ashamed. We become clumsy when confronted. That may still hurt. It may still require repair. But gaslighting is more specific than ordinary conflict. It is a repeated pattern of undermining another person's confidence in their perception, memory, judgment, emotional reality, or sanity, often to avoid accountability, maintain control, or preserve a preferred version of events. The key word is repeated. Gaslighting is rarely defined by one sentence in isolation. It is usually a pattern. A person names something and the response does not clarify reality. It destabilizes their relationship with reality. That never happened. You imagined that. You always exaggerate. You are too sensitive. You twist everything. You are unstable. Everyone knows you are difficult. I only did that because you made me. You remember it wrong. You are creating drama again. These phrases may appear simple, but when repeated over time, they can begin to erode the listener's confidence in their own inner compass. This is what makes gaslighting different from a simple lie. A lie may deny a fact. Gaslighting attacks the person's capacity to trust facts as they perceive them. It does not only say, that did not happen. It implies, you are the kind of person who cannot know what happened. It does not only say, I disagree. It implies, your perception is defective. It not only protects the speaker from accountability, it trains the listener to doubt themselves before they even speak. Over time, this changes behavior. The person being gaslit may begin gathering evidence compulsively. They may save messages, replay conversations, ask others for confirmation, over-explain their feelings, apologize before they have understood what happened, or soften their language so much that the original truth disappears. They may enter conversations already expecting their perception to be challenged. They may say, maybe I'm overreacting, not as a genuine act of humility, but as a preemptive surrender. They may begin needing the very person who destabilizes them to confirm what is real. That dependency is one of the most damaging effects. When someone repeatedly makes you doubt your perception, you may start looking to them for reality confirmation. The person who created confusion becomes the person you hope will resolve it. This is how control deepens. The nervous system starts seeking safety from the source of instability. You become less anchored in your own observation and more dependent on their mood, their version, their approval, their explanations, their occasional reassurance. Gaslighting often works through ambiguity. It rarely appears as a clean, obvious denial every time. Sometimes it is subtle. A person says, I'm sorry you feel that way, when what is needed is accountability for behavior. They say, I never said that, when perhaps they said it indirectly, repeatedly, through implication. They say, you are making this into something it isn't, without addressing the specific concern. They say I was joking after using humor to humiliate. They say, you always need to make me the villain, when the actual issue is a pattern of behavior. They shift the conversation away from what happened and towards the supposed flaw in your reaction. That shift is important. In gaslighting dynamics, the original issue often disappears. You raise a concern about behavior, and suddenly the conversation becomes about your tone. You mention something hurtful, and suddenly, the problem is that you are too sensitive. You ask for clarity, and suddenly, you are controlling. You name inconsistency, and suddenly, you are paranoid. You remember something, and suddenly your memory is unreliable. The battleground moves from the behavior to your right to perceive the behavior. This is where it connects to framing. Gaslighting is often framing, plus repetition, plus emotional destabilization. The frame says, you are unreliable. Repetition makes that frame familiar. Emotional destabilization makes you doubt yourself. And eventually, the person may begin carrying the gaslighter's voice internally. They no longer need the other person to say, you are overreacting, because they now say it to themselves. They no longer need the other person to say, "You imagined that," because they begin questioning their own memory automatically. The external distortion becomes an internalized interpreter. This is why gaslighting can feel so disorientating. It does not always produce immediate anger. It often produces fog, confusion, a feeling of being emotionally tangled. You may leave the conversation less certain than when you entered. You may struggle to explain what happened because each specific sentence can be defended as reasonable. You may know something felt wrong, but not be able to prove it cleanly. You may feel guilty for even naming it. The pattern is slippery because the manipulation is often located not only in the words, but in the rhythm of denial, reversal, minimization, and emotional pressure. A classic structure is denial, reversal, and blame. First, the behavior is denied, that did not happen. Then the concern is reframed, you are twisting it. Then responsibility is reversed, you are the one causing problems. The person raising the concern becomes the person on trial. They may then spend the rest of the conversation trying to prove they are not unstable, not unfair, not cruel, not dramatic, not attacking. Meanwhile, the original behavior remains unexamined. Another structure is minimization. It was not that serious. You are making a big deal out of nothing. Anyone else would have moved on. Minimization is powerful because it does not always deny the event. It denies the legitimacy of the impact. It says, yes, maybe something happened, but your response to it proves there is something wrong with you. This can be especially damaging when the person already carries shame around being too much, too sensitive, too emotional, or difficult. There is also selective memory. The manipulator remembers everything that supports their position and forgets everything that challenges it. They may deny promises, alter timelines, leave out context, or present themselves as confused by your reaction. If you bring evidence, they may shift to intention. I did not mean it that way. If you address intention, they may shift to impact on them. I cannot believe you think so badly of me. If you address impact, they may shift to your tone. The ground keeps moving. The conversation never lands. That moving ground is what reality distortion feels like. You are not debating one claim. You are trying to stand on a floor that keeps changing shape. This is why discernment has to be grounded in specifics. When perception becomes the battleground, specificity is stabilizing. What exactly was said? What exactly was done? When did it happen? Is this a repeated pattern? What did I feel at the time? What was the response when I named it? Did the conversation move towards clarity or away from it? Did the person address the behavior, or did they make my perception the problem? Did I leave the conversation clearer or more confused? Did the repair happen, or only an emotional reset? Specificity matters because gaslighting thrives in fog. It thrives in global accusations, vague denials, emotional overwhelm, and shifting frames. A grounded response might sound like, I am not debating my entire character. I am asking about this specific behavior. Or, we can discuss my tone later, but I want to stay with the original issue. Or, you may remember it differently, but I am not willing to dismiss my experience simply because you disagree with it. Or, if we cannot talk about what happened without turning my perception into the problem, I need to pause this conversation. These responses do not accuse immediately. They stabilize the field. They return the conversation to reality testing. This is also why external reality anchors can be helpful. Not in the sense of building a courtroom for every relationship, but in the sense of maintaining contact with the world outside the distorted field. Writing down what happened after a confusing interaction can help. Talking to a grounded person who does not simply inflame the situation can help. Looking for patterns over time can help. Asking, what would I think if a friend described this to me, can help. The goal is not to outsource perception entirely, but to restore confidence in perception through reflection, evidence, and pattern recognition. However, discernment must remain balanced. Not every person who makes you doubt yourself is gaslighting you. Sometimes someone challenges your interpretation because your interpretation is incomplete. Sometimes people remember differently because memory is imperfect. Sometimes people say, that was not my intention, because it genuinely was not. Sometimes someone thinks you are overreacting because the reaction is disproportionate. This is why the word gaslighting should not be used as a shortcut whenever we feel misunderstood. The difference lies in openness to reality. A person who is not gaslighting may still be defensive at first, but they can often return to the issue. They can eventually say, I see how that landed. They can be specific. They can tolerate mutual reality testing. They can acknowledge impact without requiring total submission to your interpretation. They can disagree without making you defective. They can repair. A gaslighting pattern tends to move away from mutual reality testing. It avoids specifics, reverses blame, attacks perception, pathologizes reaction, changes the frame, and makes accountability feel impossible. It does not simply disagree with your conclusion. It weakens your right to have a conclusion at all. This is where nervous system awareness matters. Gaslighting often produces activation and collapse at the same time. Part of you wants to fight for reality. Another part wants to give up because the conversation feels impossible. You may feel heat, panic, fog, shame, and urgency. You may feel desperate to be understood by the person who is committed to not understanding. In that state, you may over-explain. But over-explaining often feeds the dynamic because it keeps you inside the frame that your perception requires permission. Sometimes the most discerning response is not another explanation. It is a return to self-contact. I know what I experienced. I am willing to discuss specifics, not defend my sanity. I do not need agreement to trust my observation. I can hold that you see it differently without abandoning myself. These are not just statements. They are nervous system anchors. They help bring perception back into the body. This links again to language as regulatory. The words we use internally after reality distortion matter. If the inner language becomes, maybe I am crazy, maybe I always overreact, maybe I ruin everything, the gaslighting continues inside us. But if the inner language becomes, I am confused, so I will slow down. I will return to specifics. I will not decide my entire reality inside this person's frame. The body begins to regain orientation. Language can either deepen the fog or create a path back out of it. The aim is not to become rigidly certain. Sometimes we are wrong. Sometimes we do misread. Sometimes we do need correction. But correction and gaslighting are not the same. Correction clarifies reality. Gaslighting destabilizes your access to reality. Correction may feel uncomfortable, but it leaves you more oriented. Gaslighting leaves you less oriented and more dependent. So the practice here is careful. When you suspect gaslighting, do not begin with the label. Begin with the pattern. What happened? What was denied? What was reversed? What was minimized? What became the focus instead? How often does this happen? What happens when you ask for specifics? Does the person move towards clarity or away from it? Are you able to remain connected to your perception, or do you repeatedly leave the interaction doubting your basic reality? The label may come later if it fits, but the pattern is what matters, because perception is sacred, not because it is always correct, but because without trust in our capacity to perceive, we become vulnerable to anyone who can provide a substitute reality. Discernment does not mean believing the first interpretation. It does mean protecting the part of us that is allowed to observe, question, remember, test, and know. Gaslighting attacks that part, and the first act of resistance is not always argument. Sometimes it is simply reclaiming the right to remain in contact with what you saw, what you felt, what you remember, and what still needs to be examined clearly. Triangulation and social pressure, using other people to shape perception. If gaslighting makes perception unstable from within the conversation, triangulation often destabilizes perception by bringing in the imagined or actual judgment of others. It is one of the most powerful forms of emotional pressure because it not only makes a person question what happened, it makes them question how they are being seen. And once social threat enters the field, discernment becomes much harder to access. Triangulation happens when a third party, group, comparison, rumor, outside authority, or wider audience is used to influence the emotional meaning of an interaction. Instead of dealing directly with the issue between two people, the manipulator pulls in someone else, real or implied, to create pressure. Everyone agrees you're the problem. Other people have noticed your tone. My ex never reacted like this. Even your friends think you're overreacting. The whole team feels this way. People are starting to talk. You're the only one who has an issue with this. Notice what happens when these phrases enter the field. The original issue immediately expands. You are no longer responding only to the person in front of you. You are responding to an implied social court. Your reputation is now involved. Your status is involved. Your belonging is involved. You may begin wondering who has been spoken to, what has been said, what people think, whether you are isolated, whether you are being judged, and whether your perception is still safe to trust. This is why triangulation can be so destabilizing. It transforms a direct conversation into a social threat. In a healthy conversation, if someone has a concern, they can name it directly. They can say, when this happened, I experienced it this way. They can speak from their own perception. But triangulation avoids that direct ownership. It borrows the weight of others. It says, it's not just me. And sometimes that may be true. Sometimes patterns are visible to more than one person. Sometimes outside perspectives are useful. Sometimes a group genuinely needs to address a shared concern. The problem is not that other people are ever involved. The problem is when other people are used vaguely, strategically, or anonymously to create shame, isolation, or compliance. The vague triangle is especially powerful. People have noticed. Which people? Not clear. Everyone agrees. Who exactly? Not specified. You have a reputation. According to whom? Unknown. This vagueness creates a fog. The person cannot respond to the actual concern because the concern is not attached to a clear source, example, or context. They are left defending themselves against an atmosphere. This is different from honest feedback. Honest feedback is specific. It names behavior, context, impact, and the person speaking. Triangulated pressure often hides behind a generalized consensus. It makes the accused person feel surrounded while denying them the ability to examine the evidence. That is why one of the first discernment questions around triangulation is, who is actually speaking? Is this the concern of the person in front of me? Is it a documented pattern? Is it feedback from identifiable people who are willing to speak directly? Or is the supposed group being used as emotional leverage? If someone says, everyone thinks this, it is reasonable to ask, who specifically has raised this concern, and what exactly was said? Not aggressively, not defensively, groundedly. Because if the concern is real, it should be possible to discuss it clearly. If clarity is refused, the social reference may be serving pressure more than truth. Triangulation also appears through comparison. My previous partner never had a problem with this. Other employees manage this fine. Your sibling understands me better. Most people would be grateful. Someone more mature would not react like this. These comparisons do not necessarily address the issue. They position the person as deficient by contrasting them against someone supposedly better, easier, more agreeable, more loyal, more grateful, or more controlled. The point is not understanding. The point is pressure through inadequacy. Comparison triangulation is powerful because it activates shame and competition. Instead of asking, "Is my concern valid?" the person begins asking, "What is wrong with me compared to them?" The frame shifts from behavior to worth. The person may then work harder to prove they are reasonable, mature, loving, capable, loyal, or good enough. This is how triangulation recruits insecurity. In relationships, triangulation can create jealousy and dependency. One partner repeatedly mentions how other people admire them, desire them, understand them, or treat them better. This may be subtle, a comment about an ex, a colleague, an online admirer, a friend who gets it, or someone who supposedly would not make the same demands. The effect is to make the other person feel replaceable, insecure, or pressured to compete for approval. They may begin tolerating things they would otherwise question because they fear being compared unfavorably. In families, triangulation can preserve unhealthy systems. A parent complains to one child about another. Siblings are positioned against each other. One person becomes the problem, another becomes the golden one, another becomes the rescuer, and another becomes the witness. Direct communication is replaced by alliances, side conversations, and emotional reporting. The family system avoids the central truth by distributing pressure through triangles. People learn not to speak directly because direct speech threatens the structure. In workplaces, triangulation can appear as a professional concern. A manager says, "Several people have mentioned your attitude, but gives no specific examples," or "The team is finding you difficult," without naming behaviors, contexts, or opportunities for repair. This creates anxiety. The person may become hypervigilant, overly compliant, afraid to ask questions, or desperate to restore their reputation. Again, the issue may be real, but if the feedback is vague and socially loaded, it becomes harder to address constructively. A healthy workplace would say, "In Tuesday's meeting, when you interrupted twice and dismissed the proposal, 2 team members said they felt unable to contribute. Let's discuss how you can raise concerns without closing the conversation." That is specific. It can be examined. A triangulated version says, "People are starting to feel you're not a team player." That creates shame without clarity. This is where game theory becomes useful. Triangulation changes the incentives of the interaction. Without triangulation, the person may simply evaluate the issue. What happened? What do I think? What is fair? What is my boundary? But once social pressure is introduced, the incentives shift. Now they may be trying to protect status, avoid exclusion, preserve belonging, repair reputation, stop gossip, or prove loyalty. The decision is no longer purely about truth. It is about social survival. This is why triangulation is so effective. We are sensitive to social threat. Being judged, excluded, misunderstood, or publicly framed as the problem activates deep nervous system responses. We are not built to be indifferent to belonging. So when someone implies that others are against us, the body may move into defense, appeasement, panic, shame, or collapse. The manipulator does not have to prove the social threat fully. They only have to make us feel it. The question then becomes, what does the social pressure make me more likely to do? Does it make me apologize before I know what I am apologizing for? Does it make me abandon a valid concern? Does it make me over-explain? Does it make me smaller? Does it make me attack? Does it make me compete? Does it make me seek approval from the person creating the pressure? Does it make me accept a frame I would not accept if the conversation were direct? These are discernment questions. They help us notice when our behavior is being shaped not by clarity, but by social threat. Triangulation is also common in online culture. Public controversies often become massive triangulation fields. A person says something, and instead of direct engagement, screenshots circulate. Audiences gather, groups interpret, strangers become witnesses, judges, defenders, prosecutors, and amplifiers. The individual is no longer only responding to the original issue. They are responding to a crowd. The crowd becomes part of the pressure. This is why online conflict escalates so quickly. The social field rewards performance, not always truth. In digital spaces, triangulation can make people feel morally surrounded. Everyone is calling this out. The internet has decided, the community knows. If you still support this person, that says something about you. Sometimes collective accountability is necessary. Sometimes public patterns need to be named. But public pressure can also flatten complexity and make people afraid to ask proportionate questions. The crowd becomes a substitute for evidence. The number of voices becomes a proxy for truth, but a large reaction is not the same as an accurate interpretation. This is where discernment must distinguish between collective witness and collective coercion. Collective witness says, "This pattern has affected many people, and it deserves attention." Collective coercion says, "Agree with the crowd immediately or become suspect yourself." The first can reveal hidden harm. The second can punish thought before understanding. Triangulation also overlaps with gaslighting when the opinions of others are used to undermine perception. Everyone thinks you're unstable. Your friends only agree with you because they hear your version. No one else would put up with you. People are worried about you. These phrases may create deep self-doubt because they suggest the problem is not only between two people, The whole social world is supposedly seeing you incorrectly, or perhaps seeing you more clearly than you see yourself. The person begins to wonder whether they are the last one to know the truth about themselves. This can be devastating when someone already carries shame. Shame makes triangulation more powerful because shame is always concerned with how the self is seen. If a manipulator can make the person feel exposed before an invisible audience, they can make them easier to control. The person may comply simply to stop the feeling of social exposure. So what does applied discernment look like? First, return to specificity. What exactly is the concern? Who is raising it? What behavior are we discussing? When did it happen? What would repair look like? Specificity turns the vague social fog into examinable reality. Second, separate the issue from the implied audience. I am willing to discuss your concern directly. I am not willing to respond to unnamed people or vague group judgment. This does not dismiss feedback. It protects the conversation from becoming a social ambush. Third, notice the state being created. Do you feel shame, panic, competition, isolation, urgency, or fear of rejection? That state may be part of the pressure. Name it internally before acting on it. Fourth, ask whether the person is using others to clarify or to dominate. Sometimes third-party input genuinely helps. A mediator, counselor, HR process, trusted witness, or group dialogue can support clarity. But when others are used vaguely, secretly, or strategically, they may be functioning as leverage. Fifth, watch the pattern over time. Does this person often use other people to pressure you? Do they quote unnamed voices? Do they compare you to others? Do they create insecurity by mentioning alternatives? Do they avoid speaking directly? Do they make you feel socially unsafe whenever you raise a concern? If so, the pattern matters more than any single phrase. A grounded response might sound like, I am open to feedback, but I need specifics rather than general references to what people think. Or, please speak from your own experience rather than bringing in unnamed others. Or, if there is a group concern, let's address it transparently with the people involved. Or, I am not willing to be compared to someone else as a way of pressuring my behavior. Or, we can discuss the issue directly, but I will not respond to social shame. These responses interrupt the triangle. They bring the conversation back to direct reality. Triangulation thrives when perception becomes socially unsafe. Discernment restores safety by returning to specifics, direct speech, observable behavior, and personal agency. It refuses to let an invisible audience become the authority over reality. It refuses to let comparison replace clarity. It refuses to let belonging be used as a weapon against truth. Because if someone has a real concern, it can be spoken clearly, and if it cannot be spoken clearly, we have to ask whether the point is true, or if it is pressure. Ambiguity, intermittent reinforcement, and emotional dependency. Why confusion can become addictive, one of the most subtle forms of manipulation is not direct cruelty, obvious control, or open intimidation. It is ambiguous. It is the emotional fog created when warmth and withdrawal, closeness and distance, clarity and confusion, praise and criticism, apology and repetition begin alternating in a way that destabilizes the nervous system. The person affected may not feel trapped at first. They may feel hopeful, anxious, invested, fascinated, confused, or strangely attached. And that attachment can become stronger precisely because the connection is inconsistent. This is difficult to understand from the outside. People often say, why don't they just leave? Why do they keep going back? Why are they still trying to make sense of it? But from inside the pattern, the situation does not always feel like obvious harm. It often feels unfinished. It feels like there is a truth just out of reach. It feels as if the right words are found, if the right mood appears, if the right version of the person returns, if the right explanation is finally given, everything might become clear. The person is not only attached to what is happening, they are attached to the possibility of resolution. This is where intermittent reinforcement becomes important. In simple terms, intermittent reinforcement is when reward arrives unpredictably rather than consistently. The nervous system cannot settle because it does not know when warmth, approval, affection, clarity, or relief will appear. Sometimes the person is loving, sometimes distant, sometimes accountable, sometimes evasive, sometimes admiring, sometimes critical, sometimes available, sometimes unreachable. The inconsistency becomes its own hook because the mind keeps searching for the pattern that will make the reward return. In relationships, this may look like a partner who is intensely present one day and emotionally absent the next. They send loving messages, then disappear. They apologize, then repeat the same behavior. They make promises, then become vague. They create closeness, then withdraw when vulnerability deepens. They offer just enough affection to keep hope alive, but not enough consistency to create safety. The person on the receiving end begins chasing the return of the warm version, and when warmth finally comes back, the relief can feel like love. That is the trap. Relief is not always repair. Relief is the nervous system coming down from distress. If the same person who creates the distress also provides the relief, the body can begin mistaking the relief for connection. The emotional high of reconciliation becomes fused with the anxiety of uncertainty. The person may say, but when it's good, it's amazing, and that may be true. But the question is not only how good the good moments feel. The question is what pattern the whole system creates over time. Does the relationship make you more grounded or more dependent on emotional weather? Do you feel safer over time, or do you become more hypervigilant? Do apologies lead to change, or only temporary relief? Does clarity increase, or does confusion reset after each intense conversation? Do you become more yourself, or more organized around gaining access to the version of the person you hope will stay? Ambiguity can become addictive because the mind hates unresolved meaning. When someone's behavior does not match their words, we try to solve it. When they say they care but behave inconsistently, we search for hidden reasons. When they wound us and then became tender, we wonder which version is real. When they deny intention but repeat impact, we try to reconcile the contradiction. The energy of the mind becomes tied to the puzzle. Puzzles create investment. The more energy we spend trying to understand someone, the more attached we may become to the idea that understanding will eventually bring peace. We may confuse analysis with progress. We may think, if I can just work out their trauma, their attachment style, their fear, their history, their stress, their intention, then I will know how to respond. Sometimes understanding does help, but sometimes the search for explanation becomes a way to avoid the simpler truth. Whatever the cause, the pattern is harming me. This does not mean the other person is always consciously manipulative. Some people create ambiguity because they are themselves disorganized. They want closeness but fear it. They want control because they feel unsafe. They offer affection when they feel secure and withdraw when intimacy exposes them. They may not be plotting harm, but conscious or unconscious, the effect still matters. A pattern does not need malicious intent to become destabilizing. Workplaces can create the same dynamic. A manager praises an employee intensely, then criticizes them harshly. One week they are valued and included. Next, they are ignored or subtly undermined. Expectations are unclear, but consequences are real. Approval is unpredictable, and so the employee works harder, checks more, anticipates more, and performs more. They begin to organize themselves around earning stability from an unstable system. The reward is not only career progress, it is relief from uncertainty. Ideological groups and communities can also use intermittent reinforcement. Agreement brings warmth, doubt brings distance. Public loyalty brings praise. Questioning brings suspicion. Confession brings temporary acceptance. Independence brings shame. The person learns the emotional rhythm of belonging. They know what to say to be included. They know what not to question. The group may not need explicit rules because the nervous system learns the consequences. The result is emotional dependency disguised as conviction. Social media platforms operate through similar feedback loops. A post receives attention unpredictably. Approval comes in waves. Sometimes a vulnerable post is rewarded, sometimes ignored. Sometimes outrage is amplified. Sometimes nuance disappears. The person begins checking, adjusting, performing, chasing the next signal of validation. This is not the same as a manipulative individual, but it shows how systems can condition behavior through unpredictable reward. The platform does not need to know your wounds consciously. It only needs to reward certain emotional outputs, often enough for the body to return. This is where control theory becomes useful. Behavior is shaped by feedback. If honesty leads to withdrawal and compliance leads to warmth, the system trains compliance. If emotional intensity leads to attention, intensity increases. If silence leads to pursuit, silence becomes reinforced. If confusion leads someone to seek reassurance from the same source creating confusion, dependency deepens. The system teaches the person what behavior restores temporary safety. The danger is that temporary safety can replace actual safety. Temporary safety says, they replied, I can breathe again. Actual safety says, I can trust the pattern. Temporary safety says, they apologized, maybe it will change. Actual safety says, their behavior changed consistently over time. Temporary safety says, the group accepted me again. Actual safety says, I can be honest without fearing exile. Temporary safety says, the manager praised me today. Actual safety says, expectations are clear, feedback is fair, and my dignity is not dependent on their mood. Discernment requires us to distinguish relief from repair, intensity from intimacy, explanation from accountability, and temporary warmth from consistent safety. Ambiguity is especially powerful when paired with hope. Hope can be a beautiful force. It keeps people open, patient, generous, and willing to believe in change. But hope can also become the leash that keeps someone attached to a pattern that is not changing. The person is not staying because the present is healthy. They are staying because the future version might be. They are attached to potential, to the apology that sounded sincere, to the glimpse of tenderness, to the memory of how it was at the beginning, to the idea that if they love well enough, explain clearly enough, regulate enough, endure enough, or prove enough, the pattern will finally become stable. This is why one of the hardest discernment questions is, am I responding to the pattern or to the potential? Potential matters, but pattern governs lived reality. Someone may have the potential to change. A relationship may have moments of beauty. A workplace may have good days. A group may have meaningful values. But if the repeated pattern destabilizes perception, erodes dignity, creates dependency, and makes clarity harder over time, then potential cannot be used as evidence of safety. Potential is not a pattern, it is a possibility. A grounded response begins by returning to the pattern. What happens repeatedly? What follows honesty? What follows boundary setting? What follows vulnerability? What follows accountability? What happens after apologies? What happens when you stop overfunctioning? What happens when you no longer chase? What happens when you ask for clarity? What happens when you do not accept ambiguity as normal? These questions reveal the system. If someone becomes warm only when you pull away, the warmth may be part of the control loop. If someone becomes accountable only when consequences appear, accountability may be strategic rather than integrated. If someone gives clarity only after confusion has caused distress, clarity may be functioning as relief, not repair. If a group welcomes you only when you agree, belonging may be conditional. If a workplace rewards your exhaustion but ignores your boundaries, praise may be a mechanism of extraction. The way out of ambiguity is not always an immediate departure. Sometimes it is direct clarification. Sometimes it is boundary setting. Sometimes it is slowing down. Sometimes it is asking for an observable change. Sometimes it is removing yourself from the reinforcement cycle long enough to feel your own nervous system again. But whatever the response, discernment begins by refusing to treat confusion as depth. Confusion is not always a sign that something profound is happening. Sometimes it is a sign that clarity is being withheld, avoided, or repeatedly destabilized. A clean question might be, can this be made clear? If the answer is yes, and clarity leads to changed behavior, then the ambiguity may have been misunderstanding, fear, or poor communication. If the answer is repeatedly no, and every attempt at clarity creates more confusion, shame, blame, or emotional reversal, then the ambiguity itself may be part of the pattern. This is also where boundaries become important. A boundary against ambiguity might sound like, I am willing to discuss this, but I need clear behavior rather than vague reassurance. Or, I cannot continue a pattern where we have intense conversations and nothing changes. Or, I need consistency over time, not only emotional closeness after distress. Or, I will not keep chasing clarity from someone who repeatedly benefits from keeping me uncertain. These statements do not require accusation. They return agency to the self. The manipulative power of intermittent reinforcement weakens when the person stops organizing around the next reward. When they stop asking, how do I get the warmth back, and begin asking, what does this pattern do to me? When they stop asking, which version of them is real, and begin asking, what is the whole pattern showing me? When they stop asking, how do I explain this enough for them to understand? And begin asking, what happens when I stop trying to earn clarity? That shift is profound, because confusion can become addictive when it keeps the nervous system searching for relief. But discernment interrupts the search. It steps back from the emotional maze and asks whether the maze itself is the mechanism, and sometimes, seeing the maze is the first moment of freedom. Field scenario, applied manipulation analysis. This is where we bring the theory into a lived scenario. Because manipulation is rarely understood clearly when it is described only as a tactic. It becomes clearer when we watch how the field changes in real time, how a concern becomes a character judgment, how a question becomes disloyalty, how emotional language becomes control, how shame is introduced, how social pressure is implied, how the original issue disappears, and how the person who raised the concern becomes the person defending themselves. Let's imagine a workplace, community project, podcast network, spiritual group, creative collective, wellness space, or online organization. The setting could be almost anywhere. It presents itself as conscious, inclusive, emotionally intelligent, and values-driven. THE language used in the group is warm, reflective, and progressive. People talk about safety, accountability, healing, openness, respect, growth, and shared purpose. On the surface, it appears healthy. It may even contain genuinely good people and genuinely meaningful intentions. But over time, one member begins noticing inconsistencies. Decisions are made privately, then presented as a collective agreement. Certain people are praised publicly, but criticized privately. Questions are welcomed in theory, but those who ask the wrong questions become subtly distanced from. Boundaries are spoken about often, but only some people's boundaries seem to matter. Feedback is encouraged, but when feedback points upwards towards leadership, the atmosphere changes. The person raising the concern is not attacked directly at first. Instead, the field begins to shift around them. Eventually, they decide to speak. They say something fairly simple. I'm noticing that decisions are being presented as group consensus when many of us have not actually been involved. I'm also concerned that people seem hesitant to disagree openly. Can we talk about how decisions are being made? Now, let's pause there. The stimulus is a concern about the process. It is specific enough to be examined. The person has raised an issue about transparency, participation, and group atmosphere. A healthy response would stay with the concern. It might be, thank you for raising that. Can you give examples? Let's look at where decisions are being made and whether people feel able to contribute. That would not mean the concern is automatically correct. It would simply mean the group is willing to reality test it. But in a manipulative field, something else happens. The leader responds calmly, perhaps even kindly. They say, I'm sorry you feel that way. We always want this to be a safe space. But I have to be honest, several people have mentioned that your tone has felt quite intense recently. I wonder if this is less about the decision-making process and more about your accountability relationship. Sometimes when people feel triggered, they project control onto leadership rather than reflecting on their own discomfort. On the surface, this may sound emotionally intelligent. It uses modern emotional language. It mentions safety, honesty, accountability, triggers, projection, reflection, and discomfort. But the function of the response needs to be examined. Did it address the original concern? Did it clarify the decision-making process? Did it invite examples? Did it open the field? Or did it shift the focus from the concern to the person raising it? This is the first movement of manipulation analysis. Follow the focus. The original focus was group decision-making. The response shifted the focus to the person's tone, emotional state, projection, and accountability relationship. This does not automatically mean the leader is wrong. Tone can matter. Projection can happen. People can raise real concerns from activated states, but timing matters. If every concern about leadership is immediately converted into a concern about the emotional state of the person raising it, the field is no longer examining reality. It is protecting the frame. Now look at the emotional activation. The person who raised the concern may suddenly feel shame. They may think, was I too intense? They may feel exposed because several people have supposedly mentioned their tone. They may feel isolated, wondering who has been talking about them. They may feel confused because the language sounds sophisticated, but something feels off. They may begin defending themselves. I didn't mean to sound intense. I'm not projecting. I'm just trying to understand. Already, they have been moved out of the original issue and into self-defense. That is the second movement, emotional displacement. The person is no longer asking, how are decisions being made? They are now trying to prove they are reasonable, safe, reflective, and not triggered. The leader did not need to directly silence the concern. They only needed to make the emotional cost of continuing the concern higher. The person now risks being seen as intense, unaccountable, unsafe, or projecting if they persist. Next, examine the frame. The leader's response created a particular frame. The group is safe. Leadership is accountable. The person raising the concern may be triggered, and the issue may be their discomfort rather than the process. Inside this frame, continuing to question leadership becomes emotionally risky. It may appear defensive. It may appear like resistance to accountability. It may appear like proof of the very thing being suggested. This is a classic trap. The person's attempt to clarify becomes evidence that they are the problem. This is framing at work. The next element is shame induction. Several people have mentioned your tone. That phrase introduces an invisible audience. It tells the person that others have been evaluating them, but it does not provide specifics. Who mentioned it? When? What exactly was said? What behavior are we discussing? Was anyone willing to raise it directly? Without clarity, the phrase functions as social pressure. It creates shame without providing a path to reality testing. This is triangulation. The person is not only responding to the leader now, they are responding to a vague group judgment. Their social safety is threatened. They may become more compliant, more apologetic, more careful, or more anxious. They may stop raising concerns because the next concern might further damage how others see them. Now consider the gaslighting adjacent ambiguity. The leader did not say, your concern is false. They said, I wonder if this is less about the decision-making process and more about your accountability relationship. This is slippery. It is framed as curiosity, but it redirects the issue into a psychological interpretation of the person. It implies that their perception may be a projection. Again, projection can be real, but when used prematurely, without addressing the original claim, it becomes a way of destabilizing perception. The person may begin asking themselves, am I projecting? That is not necessarily bad. Self-reflection is healthy. But if the self-reflection is induced in a way that prevents examination of the external pattern, it becomes a tool of control. The person's inner work becomes a distraction from the group's outer structure. This is one of the most sophisticated forms of manipulation in modern emotional culture, using the language of self-awareness to redirect attention away from observable behavior. Now let's walk through the full sequence. The stimulus, a member raises a concern about decision-making and group openness. Emotional activation, the leader's response activates shame, confusion, social threat, and self-doubt. Frame control, the concern is reframed as possible projection, intensity, or avoidance of accountability. Shame induction, unnamed others are introduced as witnesses to the person's supposed tone problem. Triangulation, several people are used to increase social pressure without transparent dialogue. Gaslighting adjacent ambiguity, the person's perception is subtly pathologized without directly disproving the concern. Behavioral effect, the person becomes defensive, apologetic, hesitant, self-monitoring, or silent. The original concern remains unexamined. That is the theater of manipulation. The stage has been built. The roles have been assigned. The leader appears calm, reflective, and protective of the group. The person raising the concern appears intense, reactive, and possibly unaccountable. The audience, if present, may feel safer aligning with the leader because the leader controls the emotional frame. The person with the concern may now feel alone. But let's go deeper. What if the leader genuinely believes what they are saying? What if they are not consciously trying to manipulate? That is possible, and it matters. Not every harmful pattern is calculated. Some leaders, partners, parents, managers, or community figures unconsciously use emotional language to protect themselves from challenge. They may experience criticism as a threat. They may genuinely interpret dissent as instability. They may have built an identity around being safe, wise, healed, or conscious, so any challenge to their behavior feels like an attack on their self-concept. But the impact remains the impact. Discernment does not require us to prove malicious intent before we name a controlling pattern. Intent is relevant, but not sufficient. The question is, what does the pattern do? Does it open reality or close it? Does it address concerns or redirect them? Does it increase clarity or confusion? Does it support agency or produce compliance? Does it allow specific feedback, or does it turn feedback into evidence against the person giving it? Now let's reconstruct the scenario through discernment. The first step is to return to the original issue. What specific concern was raised? Decision-making is being presented as group consensus without real participation. People seem hesitant to disagree openly. Those are examinable claims. Before discussing tone, projection, or accountability, the group can ask, how are decisions actually made? Who is included? Are dissenting views invited? What happens when someone disagrees? Are people safe to speak honestly, not only theoretically, but practically? The second step is to separate behavior from interpretation. The leader interpreted the concern as possibly related to the member's emotional state. That may or may not be relevant later. But the behavior being questioned is an organizational process. A discerning response keeps these layers separate. We can discuss tone if needed. But first, let's address the decision-making concern. The third step is to ask for specifics around the triangulation. You mentioned several people have concerns about my tone. I'm willing to reflect on that, but I need specifics. Who raised it? What examples were given? Is this feedback people are willing to discuss openly, or is it being used here anonymously? This does not reject feedback. It grounds it. The fourth step is to notice the emotional state. If the person feels shame, panic, or self-doubt, they can internally name, I am being pulled into defending my character. I need to return to the issue. That sentence is powerful. It interrupts the emotional displacement. The fifth step is to examine the language being used. Is safe space being used to protect openness or to protect leadership from discomfort? Is accountability being used mutually or only downward? Is projection being used carefully or as a way to dismiss perception? Is tone being used to improve communication or to avoid content? These questions reveal whether emotional language is clarifying or controlling. The sixth step is to watch the pattern over time. If this happens once, it may be poor communication. If it happens repeatedly, it becomes a structure. Every time someone raises a concern, their tone becomes the issue. Every time leadership is questioned, the questioner is framed as triggered. Every time accountability is requested, the requester is accused of being unsafe. Over time, the group learns the rules. Do not challenge the frame, or you will become the problem. This is how manipulation becomes systemic. No one needs to announce the rule. The nervous system learns it. A grounded response from the member might sound like this. I am open to reflecting on my tone if there are specific examples, but I want to return to the concern I raised. My question was about how decisions are being presented as group consensus. Can we address that directly before moving into an interpretation of my emotional state? That response does several things. It does not become defensive. It does not accept the frame blindly. It does not deny the possibility of feedback. It returns to the original issue. It asks for specificity. It refuses to let emotional language replace reality testing. Another response might be, I hear the safety concern, and I share that value. For me, safety includes being able to question group process without being psychologically interpreted for doing so. That sentence challenges the frame directly. It reclaims the meaning of safety. It refuses the idea that safety only belongs to those in power or those controlling the language. Now imagine how the field might react. A healthy group may pause and say, that is fair. Let's address the process. A defensive or manipulative group may intensify the frame. This is exactly what we mean. You are making it difficult to hold you accountable. That reaction provides information. If the field cannot tolerate grounded clarification, then the issue is larger than one conversation. This scenario also applies to relationships. Someone raises a concern. When you disappear after conflict and then return as if nothing happened, it leaves me confused. The response, you're projecting abandonment wounds onto me. I can't be responsible for your triggers. Again, there may be truth in the mention of triggers, but if the response avoids the behavior, disappearing after conflict, emotional language is being used defensively. A discerning reply might be, my abandonment wound may be activated, and I am willing to own that. But the pattern I'm naming is that you leave conflict unresolved and return without repair. Can we address that behavior? This is the balance. Own what belongs to you. Do not accept responsibility for what you do not do. Keep the pattern visible. Do not let therapeutic language erase observable behavior. A similar workplace example, an employee says, the expectations keep changing, and I'm struggling to know what success looks like. The manager replies, you seem resistant to feedback, and I need people who can be adaptable. Again, the frame shifts. The employee's concern about unclear expectations becomes a character issue, resistance. A grounded response might be, I'm open to feedback and adaptation. To do that well, I need the expectations written clearly so I can meet them. That returns the conversation to structure rather than shame. The signature practice of this episode is to identify when a concern is being transformed into a character trial. That is often the moment manipulation enters. You raise behavior, they discuss your personality. You raise a process, they discuss your tone. You raise inconsistency, they discuss your wounds. You raise accountability, they discuss your lack of compassion. You raise harm, they discuss how hurtful it is that you would think that of them. The discerning person learns to say, we can discuss me later, but first we need to discuss what happened. This does not mean tone, wounds, character, or emotional state are never relevant. They are. But they should not be used as escape routes from observable reality. In healthy dialogue, both can be examined. In manipulative dialogue, the person with the concern becomes the entire subject, and the original concern disappears. So in any applied manipulation analysis, ask, what was the original issue? What did the response do to the issue? What emotional state did the response create? What frame was introduced? Were unnamed others brought in? Was shame used? Was the person's perception pathologized? Was the conversation moved towards clarity or away from it? What behavior changed afterwards? These questions slow down the theater. They let you see the lighting, the script, the roles, the audience, and the hidden incentives. And once you see the stage, you do not have to perform the role automatically, because manipulation often works by making the assigned role feel like the only safe position. Discernment begins when you realize you are allowed to step out of the scene and ask who built it. Discernment against manipulation. How to stay clear without becoming paranoid after looking at framing, gaslighting, triangulation, ambiguity, intermittent reinforcement, emotional leverage, and the theater of manipulation in action. We now have to come back to balance. Because there is a danger in this territory. Once you begin seeing how perception can be shaped, how emotion can be steered, how language can be used to control the field, and how people can manipulate through guilt, shame, fear, desire, confusion, or belonging, the mind can easily become suspicious of everything. That is not discernment. Suspicion is not the same as clarity. Hypervigilance is not the same as wisdom. Cynicism is not the same as protection. And seeing manipulation everywhere can become another form of distortion. It may feel safer to assume hidden motives, to distrust every warm gesture, to interpret every silence as strategy, every disagreement as gaslighting, every boundary as abandonment, every emotional request as control. But that does not free perception. It narrows it in a different direction. The goal is not to become paranoid. The goal is to become less available to manipulation while remaining capable of trust, connection, nuance, and proportion. That distinction matters because discernment has to protect two things at once: the self's right to see clearly and the heart's capacity to remain open. If we only protect ourselves by closing down, we may avoid some harm, but we also lose contact with life. If we only stay open without discernment, we may become vulnerable to those who know how to use openness against us. So the work is neither naive trust nor total distrust. The work is grounded in perception. The first practice is to slow the emotional field. Manipulation often depends on speed. Decide now, respond now, prove yourself now, apologize now, choose now, believe now, defend yourself now, join now, leave now, fear now, trust now. The more emotionally urgent the field becomes, the less room there is for reality testing. So one of the strongest protective moves is the pause. Not the passive pause of avoidance, but the conscious pause of regulation. I need time to think. I want to understand this before I respond. I am not making a decision while I feel pressured. I will come back to this when I can see it more clearly. The pause interrupts emotional steering. It gives the nervous system time to settle, the mind time to widen, and the self time to return from the frame being imposed. A manipulative field often dislikes the pause because time allows the person to compare, reflect, seek grounded counsel, examine evidence, notice inconsistency, and recover agency. Healthy communication can usually tolerate a pause. Manipulation often treats the pause as betrayal. The second practice is to identify the frame. Ask, what interpretation am I being invited into? What role am I being assigned? Am I being positioned as selfish, unstable, unsafe, cruel, difficult, disloyal, immature, or ungrateful before the issue has been examined? Is someone presenting themselves as the rescuer, the victim, the authority, the only safe person, the only honest one, or the only person who understands? What does this frame make easier to believe? What does it make harder to say? This is crucial because once you argue inside someone else's frame, you may already be halfway captured. If the frame is you are being defensive, everything you say to clarify may be treated as more defensive. If the frame is you do not care, every attempt to set a boundary may be treated as proof. If the frame is everyone else agrees, your disagreement may feel socially dangerous. So discernment sometimes begins not by answering the accusation, but by naming the structure. I am willing to discuss what happened, but I do not accept the frame that asking questions means I'm avoiding accountability. The third practice is to separate behavior from interpretation. Manipulation thrives when interpretations are treated as facts. You raised your voice is behavior. You were trying to intimidate me is an interpretation. You did not reply for 2 days is a behavior. You were punishing me is an interpretation. You changed the plan without telling me is a behavior. You do not respect me is an interpretation. The interpretation may be accurate, but it still needs examination. When we separate behavior from interpretation, we stabilize reality. We create something that can be discussed, tested, confirmed, challenged, or repaired. This is useful both when we are being manipulated and when we might be projecting. It keeps us honest. It prevents us from turning feelings into verdicts too quickly. It also prevents others from making us responsible for interpretations that have not been grounded in observable reality. A clean question is, what specifically happened? Another is, what behavior are we discussing? Another is, what evidence supports that interpretation? These questions are not cold, they are clarifying. The fourth practice is to ask for specifics. Manipulation often hides in vagueness. People are saying, you always do this, you made everyone uncomfortable, you are being toxic, you are not safe, you need to work on yourself. These phrases may contain something worth examining, but without specifics, they create fog. Specifics bring the conversation back to reality. When, where, what was said, what was done, who was involved, what pattern exists, and what would repair look like. If someone has a genuine concern, specificity should help. If someone resists specificity repeatedly, that tells you something. It may mean they are speaking from emotional charge, not grounded observation. It may mean they want the power of the accusation without the accountability of clarity. It may mean they are using language to create pressure rather than understanding. The fifth practice is to watch patterns over time. Manipulation is often clearest in repetition. One confusing conversation may be poor communication. Repeated confusion after every attempt at accountability is a pattern. One defensive response may be human. Repeated reversal of blame is a pattern. One apology may be meaningful. Repeated apologies without behavioral change are a pattern. One moment of withdrawal may be overwhelming. Repeated withdrawal whenever honesty appears is a pattern. Patterns reveal what performances can hide. Someone can sound sincere in one moment, but the pattern tells you whether sincerity becomes change. Someone can speak beautifully about growth, but the pattern tells you whether growth reaches behavior. Someone can say they care, but the pattern tells you whether care produces consistency, repair, and respect. Discernment trusts the pattern more than the performance. The sixth practice is to notice emotional hooks: urgency, guilt, shame, fear, flattery, desire, confusion, and belonging. Ask yourself, what emotional state is this interaction creating in me? Am I being rushed? Am I being made to feel responsible for something that is not mine? Am I being shamed into compliance? Am I being made afraid of rejection, exposure, or exclusion? Am I being flattered into lowering my boundaries? Am I being kept confused and then offered relief? Am I being asked to prove loyalty by abandoning discernment? These hooks do not automatically prove manipulation, but they are signals to slow down. They tell you which door is being touched. A discerning person learns their own emotional access points. If guilt makes you overgive, notice guilt. If shame makes you apologize too quickly, notice shame. If flattery makes you trust too fast, notice flattery. If fear makes you comply, notice fear. If belonging makes you silence yourself, notice belonging. Self-knowledge is protection. The seventh practice is to keep reality testing both internal and external. Internal reality testing asks, what do I know? What do I feel? What am I assuming? What state am I in? External reality testing asks, what evidence exists? What do trustworthy people observe? What has happened over time? What would this look like if I were advising someone else? This matters because manipulation often isolates perception. It either makes you distrust yourself completely or become trapped in your own reactive interpretation. Good reality testing restores balance. But choose external mirrors carefully. Do not seek only people who inflame your reaction. Do not seek only people who tell you what you want to hear. Look for grounded witnesses, people who can hold complexity, ask precise questions, recognize harm without feeding paranoia, and challenge you without dismissing you. A good mirror helps you see more clearly, not merely feel more justified. The eighth practice is to avoid reacting from the state the manipulator creates. This is difficult but essential. If someone creates shame and you respond by over-explaining, the pattern may continue. If someone creates fear and you comply instantly, the pattern is reinforced. If someone creates anger and you explode, they may use your reaction to confirm their frame. If someone creates confusion and you chase clarity from them endlessly, dependency deepens. Sometimes the most powerful response is to step out of the state before deciding. You might say, I am too activated to respond well right now. Or, I am not going to defend my character while the original issue remains unaddressed. Or, I need to pause because I can feel this conversation moving away from clarity. This is not a weakness. It is refusing to let someone else's field determine the quality of your response. The ninth practice is to set clean boundaries. A clean boundary is specific, self-responsible, and grounded in behavior. It does not need to diagnose the other person. It does not need to win the moral argument. It says what you will or will not participate in. I will discuss the issue, but not through insults. I will respond when the concern is made specific. I am not willing to continue a conversation where my perception is repeatedly dismissed. I need consistency over time, not only apologies. I am stepping away from this group if questions are treated as betrayal. Clean boundaries are powerful because they do not require the other person to agree with your entire interpretation. They return the agency to you. They shift the question from how do I make them understand to what am I willing to remain inside. And finally, the 10th practice is proportion. Not every hurt person is manipulative. Not every defensive person is gaslighting. Not every confusing relationship is abusive. Not every intense personality is dangerous. Not every emotional request is in control. Sometimes people are clumsy, wounded, overwhelmed, immature, frightened, or simply different from us. Discernment requires the humility to distinguish between harm, incompatibility, poor communication, unconscious patterning, and deliberate control. This proportion protects us from becoming unjust in the name of self-protection. It keeps discernment from hardening into suspicion. It allows us to name real manipulation without turning the whole world into a threat. Because the aim is not to become untouchable, the aim is to become clear. Clear enough to pause when emotion is being activated. Clear enough to ask for specifics. Clear enough to see the frame. Clear enough to trust patterns over performances. Clear enough to leave when the field repeatedly distorts reality. Clear enough to stay open where trust is earned. Clear enough to know that protection and openness do not have to be enemies. Manipulation narrows perception. Discernment widens it again. Integration, seeing the stage without becoming trapped in it. So, as we come towards the close of this episode, we return to the central image, manipulation as theatre. Not theatre in the sense of entertainment, exaggeration, or melodrama, but theatre in the structural sense. A stage is created, roles are assigned, scripts are implied, emotional lighting is arranged, the audience is positioned. Certain meanings are made easier to accept, while other truths become costly to speak. That is often how manipulation works. It does not always arrive as a force, it often arrives as an atmosphere, as framing, as an implication, as guilt, as shame, as urgency, as selective warmth, as social pressure, as ambiguity, as a carefully shaped emotional field where one response feels safer than another. The person being manipulated may still believe they are choosing freely, but the available choices have already been emotionally arranged. One path offers relief, another path threatens rejection, one path brings approval, another path brings shame, one path restores temporary warmth, another path risks conflict, isolation, or being framed as difficult. This is why manipulation is not always obvious from inside the scene. From the outside, someone may ask, why didn't they just say no, or why didn't they leave, or why didn't they see what was happening? But inside the theatre, the emotional architecture is different. The person is not only responding to the facts, they are responding to the role they have been given, the cost of stepping outside it, and the atmosphere created around their possible choices. The discerning person learns to see the stage without automatically playing the assigned role. They begin to ask, what role am I being given here? Am I being positioned as selfish, unstable, unsafe, cruel, defensive, immature, ungrateful, disloyal, or difficult before the actual issue has been examined? Am I being pulled into proving my goodness rather than discussing what happened? Am I being asked to defend my entire character when I only raised a specific concern? Am I being turned into the problem because the original problem is inconvenient? Then they ask, what emotion am I being pushed into? Is this interaction creating guilt, shame, fear, urgency, confusion, longing, dependency, or social threat? Am I being made to feel that if I do not agree, I will lose belonging? If I say no, I will be cruel? If I ask for evidence, will I be defensive? If I need time, I will be avoidant? If I remember correctly, I will be unstable. If I keep asking, I will become the villain? This matters because manipulation rarely controls behavior directly at first. It often controls the emotional cost of behavior. It makes compliance feel like care. It makes silence feel like maturity. It makes self-abandonment feel like compassion. It makes doubt feel like betrayal. It makes asking questions feel like an attack. It makes leaving the stage feel more dangerous than staying inside the role. Then the discerning person asks, what conclusion am I being rushed towards? Am I being rushed to apologize before I understand what I did? Am I being rushed to forgive before the repair has happened? Am I being rushed to agree before the evidence is clear? Am I being rushed to doubt myself before I have examined my perception? Am I being rushed to see someone as a victim, villain, rescuer, authority, or problem before the whole field has been seen? Rushing is one of the signs that discernment is under pressure. Not always, because sometimes life does require quick action. But when emotional urgency is being used to prevent reflection, something needs to slow down. Manipulation often dislikes time because time allows the nervous system to settle. Time allows the story to be checked. Time allows patterns to be compared. Time allows reality testing to return. Then we ask, what happens if I do not accept this frame? This is one of the most revealing questions in the whole episode. A healthy frame can tolerate examination. It can handle questions. It can handle specificity. It can handle the possibility that more than one layer is true. A manipulative frame often punishes the refusal to enter it. If you will not accept the frame, you are shamed. If you question it, you are accused. If you pause, you are pressured. If you ask for specifics, you are told you are avoiding accountability. If you return to the original issue, you are told you are being difficult. The reaction to your refusal often reveals the nature of the frame. A healthy person may feel uncomfortable, but they can usually return to the issue. A healthy group may feel challenged, but it can examine the structure. A healthy relationship can survive clarification. A manipulative field cannot easily tolerate someone stepping outside the script, because the script is part of the control. Then we ask, what behavior is being rewarded? If compliance brings warmth and honesty brings withdrawal, the system is training compliance. If silence brings peace and truth brings punishment, the system is training silence. If confusion leads to reassurance from the same person who created the confusion, dependency is being reinforced. If public loyalty brings belonging and private doubt brings suspicion, the group is training obedience. If apologizing restores connection, but naming the pattern creates exile, then apology may become a survival response rather than a moral act. This is where control theory becomes practical. Behavior is shaped by feedback. We learn what is safe by what happens next. A manipulative system does not always need to command us directly. It only has to reward the behaviors that serve it and punish the behaviors that threaten it. Over time, the nervous system adapts. The person begins managing the field before they even realize they are doing it. And then we ask the deepest question, what truth is being made difficult to speak? In every manipulative theatre, there is usually a truth that becomes emotionally expensive. In a family, it may be the truth that the approved story is protecting someone from accountability. In a workplace, it may be the truth that leadership speaks the language of well-being while using pressure, ambiguity, or fear. In a relationship, it may be the truth that love is mixed with control. In a group, it may be the truth that belonging depends on agreement. In public discourse, it may be the truth that the dominant narrative is emotionally satisfying but incomplete. Manipulation often does not begin by banning truth. It begins by making truth costly. You can speak, but you will lose warmth. You can ask, but you will be labeled difficult. You can remember, but you will be told you are unstable. You can leave, but you will be called selfish. You can disagree, but you will become unsafe. You can name the pattern, but the group will protect the frame. So the discerning person learns to notice not only what is being said, but what cannot be said without consequence. And this brings us back to proportion. Not every difficult conversation is manipulation. Not every uncomfortable feeling is evidence of control. Not every defensive response is gaslighting. Not every inconsistency is abuse. People are human. They are wounded, frightened, clumsy, reactive, immature, overwhelmed, proud, ashamed, and sometimes simply wrong. Discernment requires us to hold that complexity, but proportion does not mean denial. If a pattern repeatedly narrows your perception, destabilizes your confidence, isolates you from your own knowing, makes your boundaries feel cruel, turns every concern back onto your character, and rewards compliance while punishing truth, then something important is happening. Whether conscious or unconscious, calculated or conditioned, the pattern deserves to be seen. The aim is not to diagnose everyone. The aim is to recognize the structure. Because once you see the theater, you can stop confusing the role with the self. You can realize, I do not have to become the villain because someone framed me that way. I do not have to become the rescuer because someone made their emotional stability my responsibility. I do not have to become an obedient member because a group has made belonging conditional. I do not have to become the endlessly apologetic one because someone turned my perception into a problem. You can step back. You can ask for specifics. You can return to observable behavior. You can refuse the false binary. You can name the frame. You can pause. You can set a clean boundary. You can leave the stage if the scene keeps requiring you to betray your own reality. Perhaps this is the deeper lesson of this episode. Manipulation loses power when the emotional field becomes visible. Not because visibility solves everything instantly, but because visibility restores choice. What was once atmosphere becomes structure. What was once confusion becomes a pattern. What was once shame becomes a pressure mechanism. What was once urgency becomes a tactic. What was once dependency becomes a feedback loop. What was once something feels wrong with me becomes something in this field is narrowing my perception. That shift matters. Because the goal of the discernment field is not to make us suspicious of life. It is to make us more conscious inside it. Conscious enough to recognize when emotion is being used as leverage. Conscious enough to remain open where trust is earned. Conscious enough to protect perception where trust is exploited. Conscious enough to understand the difference between healthy influence and perception management. This leads us directly into episode 4. Why intelligent people can believe absurdity. Because if manipulation can shape emotional state, and emotional state can shape interpretation, then we have to ask a more uncomfortable question. Why does intelligence alone fail to protect people from distorted beliefs? In the next episode, we move from manipulation by others into the inner architecture of belief itself. We will look at identity, ego, group belonging, cognitive dissonance, moral certainty, fear of exclusion, and the emotional investment that can make a belief feel too important to question. Because sometimes people do not believe something because it is reasonable. Sometimes they believe it because it protects them from shame. Sometimes it preserves belonging. Sometimes it gives status. Sometimes it resolves uncertainty. Sometimes it allows them to feel morally clean, intellectually superior, spiritually awake, politically righteous, or socially safe. And this is where discernment becomes more difficult. It is one thing to recognize when someone else is shaping the stage. It is another thing to recognize when our own mind has started defending a story, because the story protects something we are not ready to lose. So in episode 4, we will ask, why can highly intelligent people defend weak ideas with extraordinary confidence? Why does being wrong sometimes feel like psychological death? Why do groups reward certainty more than truth? Why does identity make certain beliefs almost impossible to question? And how can discernment remain alive when the mind wants to protect the story more than examine reality? Because the mind can be brilliant and still captured, and that is where we go next. So, as we leave this episode, consider one question. Where in your life have you been given a role inside someone else's emotional theatre? And perhaps a second, what truth became difficult to speak once that stage was built? Not to accuse, not to spiral into suspicion, but to notice. Because noticing is the beginning of freedom. May you see the frame before you enter it. May you recognize the role before you perform it. May you trust patterns more than performances. May you remain open without becoming available to control. And may your discernment become strong enough to see the stage without becoming trapped inside the scene. Until next time, thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to the Discernment Field, Episode 3, The Theatre of Manipulation and Dark Psychology. I'm James Miller.